Ladies and gentlemen, let's confront something brutally honest for a moment. We were on the brink, not just of political instability, not just of regional chaos, but of a global catastrophe. One spark, one wrong move, one ego too inflated, one button too close to being pushed. That was the margin between diplomacy and devastation. And yet, it didn't happen. World War III hasn't erupted. Why? Because amidst the noise of missiles, military drills, threats, and propaganda, Sanity finally had its moment. Not out of virtue, not out of peace, loving poetry or Instagram hashtags about hope and harmony. No, the reason World War III has been stopped is because the people in power, for once, recognized the cost of arrogance. They saw the bill coming, and it was written in blood, rubble, and the ashes of nations. We must understand the world isn't short of reasons to fight. Whether it's territorial disputes, religious ideologies, power hunger, cyber espionage, or economic warfare, the fuse is always there. But what happened recently, what truly pulled the world back from the edge, was not peace talks with roses on the table. It was fear, cold, hard, sobering fear, fear of nuclear winter. Fear of watching our children grow up in bunkers instead of classrooms. Fear of cities turning into wastelands. Fear of the finality of it all. The people who pull strings behind flags and borders realized if they go too far this time, nobody wins. No one escapes. And that, paradoxically, is what saved us. But don't kid yourself. This wasn't a victory for world peace. This was a standoff. A game of geopolitical chicken that nearly turned the planet into a funeral pyre. The reason it stopped is because someone blinked. A show of restraint, not resolution. A delay, not a solution. The world was minutes from catastrophe. People went about their daily lives, scrolling through social media, sipping their morning coffee, checking emails, while in hidden rooms and Cold War rooms, military generals and political leaders weighed the unthinkable. One wrong word, one misunderstood signal, one military aircraft flying a few kilometers too far. That was all it would have taken. It wasn't a dramatization or the script of some political thriller. It was the terrifying reality we lived in without even fully realizing it. Missiles were being moved. Borders were being tested. Satellites were locked in. Intelligence reports were red, flagging high, level alerts in real time. Diplomats walked corridors like ghosts, trying to delay what felt like the inevitable. Alliances were being activated, threats were being issued, and across several continents, the machinery of modern warfare was grinding into motion. And yet, most people remained blissfully unaware of how close we came to the edge of a global inferno. This wasn't just about two nations in conflict. It was a chain reaction waiting to be triggered. Every military action would have provoked a counteraction. One airstrike here, one naval blockade there, and suddenly every powerful nation is choosing sides, dusting off Cold War-era doctrines and preparing for the worst. A war of that scale wouldn't have stayed regional. It would have gone global in hours, not days. And make no mistake, the weapons have evolved. This isn't the age of rifles and trenches. This is the era of hypersonic missiles, unmanned drones, biological threats, and cyber attacks that can shut down power grids and financial systems in seconds. The idea of mutual destruction isn't philosophical anymore. It's a button. It's a coded sequence, it's automated, it's terrifyingly real. The fragility of peace became clearer than ever. For decades, we've operated on the assumption that nations will act rationally, that nobody wants to press the red button. But that assumption has worn thin. In a world where power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of emotionally volatile, ideologically rigid, and politically desperate leaders, rationality is no longer guaranteed. Some of these people see war as leverage, as theater, as a way to unite a fractured base or distract from internal collapse. They treat lives like numbers and casualties like acceptable losses in the name of legacy or dominance. We must stop pretending that modern war is still fought in deserts or distant villages. If World War III had broken out, cities would have gone dark within hours. Entire economies would freeze. Satellites would blink out of orbit. Hospitals would overflow. Food supplies would vanish. Global trade would crash. And the most terrifying part is how quickly it would all happen. This war wouldn't give you time to react. It wouldn't give families time to evacuate. And it certainly wouldn't give governments time to rethink. The decisions would be made in minutes, the consequences felt for generations. And that's the world we stood on the edge of. Not a hypothetical, not a simulation. A moment, a breath away from chaos. The alarms were real. The tension was real. The targets were already mapped. And as the world stared down the barrel of what could have been its last great war, you could feel the temperature of global leadership shift. Their bravado cracked just enough to reveal the fear behind the curtains. They realized that no strategy survives once the missiles start flying. No ideology matters once a mushroom cloud rises, yet the public was kept largely in the dark. The closest most people got to understanding the gravity of the situation was a headline here, a trending hashtag there, and why? Because fear doesn't sell stability. Because governments didn't want panic. Because acknowledging how close we came would force uncomfortable questions about the systems we trust to protect us. Questions like, who decides when a war starts? Who stops it? And why are those decisions so often left to the very people who benefit from the chaos? And still, through some miracle or moment of clarity, catastrophe was averted. The storm hovered but did not strike. Calls were made. Deals were whispered. Troops stood down. The world exhaled, quietly, shakily, but without celebration, because deep down everyone knew what didn't happen was more important than what did. We were minutes from catastrophe, and the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was a pause, a narrow escape, and it left a question echoing across every capital, every embassy, every home that understands the stakes. How long before we dance this close to the edge again? Fear, not diplomacy, stopped the inevitable. It wasn't eloquent speeches or carefully worded peace treaties that pulled the world back from the abyss. It was raw, primal, paralyzing fear. The kind of fear that transcends politics, borders, and military rank. The kind of fear that silences the most arrogant voices in the room. This wasn't about compromise or compassion. It was about the realization that crossing the final line would ignite a chain reaction no one could control or survive. Governments around the world knew exactly what was at stake. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies had run the simulations. Analysts had painted grim pictures of what would happen within minutes of an all-out conflict. Every major city from New York to Moscow, London to Beijing, Tehran to Tel Aviv, all of them could be wiped out or crippled in the blink of an eye. Cyber attacks could paralyze global finance and infrastructure. Nuclear weapons could erase generations in seconds. The very architecture of the world as we know it could collapse before people even understood what had begun. And that fear wasn't limited to generals and presidents. It seeped into the bones of anyone with a seat at the table. It showed up in the way leaders hesitated, the way statements were suddenly dialed back, the way military drills were postponed. It echoed in the anxious silence that followed provocative gestures. World War III wasn't stopped because world leaders suddenly rediscovered their humanity. It was stopped because even the most hardened war strategists saw that the consequences had outgrown the rewards. Diplomacy, as it's often presented, is polished, rehearsed, and fragile. It relies on trust, on mutual interest, on a willingness to de-escalate. But in the moments when the world teetered on the edge, diplomacy wasn't the hero. It was sidelined, gasping for relevance. What really made the difference was a quiet, collective understanding that nobody could walk away from the kind of war we were inching toward. No matter how powerful your army, how advanced your technology, or how loyal your allies, a war of that scale would level everything. And let's not be fooled into thinking that these fears were only about nuclear weapons. They went deeper than that. They involved the collapse of global supply chains, the triggering of refugee crises that would overwhelm entire continents, the dismantling of the internet as a tool of communication and control. There was fear of economic freefall, of social unrest, of uncontrollable pandemics sparked by chaos. In a world so tightly connected, breaking one link could unravel the entire system. That's what everyone feared, the dominoes. And so they pulled back, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other option. The fear was too big to ignore. It forced the hands of those who had been ready to gamble with lives. Suddenly, bravado gave way to calculation. Threats turned into silence. The dangerous theater of chest, puffing and missile, flexing was abandoned not for peace, but for preservation. Not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the only thing left to do if they wanted to survive their own decisions. That's the brutal truth. Fear worked. Where diplomacy stalled, fear forced clarity. It reminded those in charge that they too were mortal, that no underground bunker could guarantee safety, that no amount of military spending could shield them from the fallout. When survival becomes personal, decisions change. When leaders stop seeing war as something that happens over there and start realizing it would land at their doorstep, the game changes entirely. And yet, most people will never know how close it came. They'll never read the classified cables, the intercepted messages, the frantic last-minute calls between capitals. They won't see the quiet panic in the eyes of those who understood just how fast it could all go wrong. But make no mistake, fear was real, and it stopped the world from imploding. Not honor, not wisdom, not diplomacy. Fear. But fear is a fragile guardian. It fades. Memories fade. New leaders will rise who haven't looked into the abyss. They'll speak in absolutes, make threats they don't understand, and test the boundaries that once held. And when that fear begins to dull, when the lessons of this near miss are forgotten or ignored, the world may once again stumble toward the edge. So, yes, the World War was stopped. Not because humanity chose peace, but because it had no stomach for annihilation. Not because leaders found common ground, but because they found a mirror and saw themselves in the fallout. Fear did what diplomacy couldn't. It froze the madness just long enough for everyone to remember what was at stake. But fear can only stop the inevitable once. After that, it's up to us whether we learn or repeat. War has no winners in the modern age. That idea, once dismissed as idealistic rhetoric, is now an unshakable truth. Once upon a time, nations could claim victory in war through territory gained, governments toppled, or flags planted. But that time is long gone. Today, in an era where destruction happens in seconds and consequences ripple across continents, the idea of victory has become a dangerous illusion. When the weapons are more powerful than our morality, no one gets to win, only survive if they're lucky. Modern warfare is not a contest of strength. It's a collapse of systems. It's cities losing power, financial markets crashing in tandem, food vanishing from shelves, and hospitals overrun in a matter of days. It's satellites being knocked out of orbit, communication lines severed, and digital chaos consuming the infrastructure we take for granted. In a war like that, it doesn't matter who fired first or who responded last. Both sides bleed, both sides burn, both sides bury their dead. The fantasy of decisive victory belongs to a different century. When the United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world saw what a single weapon could do. Now, those weapons are thousands of times more powerful and in the hands of far more players. A modern nuclear exchange wouldn't end with surrender. It would end with silence. Cities would become dust, generations would vanish, and the survivors, if any, would be left to inherit a planet scarred beyond recognition. There would be no one to claim victory. There would be no one to write the history books. And that's just nuclear warfare. Cyber warfare, too, has become an invisible battlefield where no one emerges unharmed. One well-placed cyber attack can cripple entire countries. Power grids can go down, water systems can be poisoned, stock markets can crash, and transportation can freeze. Even without a single bullet being fired, lives can be lost in the thousands. And in a world that's entirely connected, the chaos doesn't stay contained. A cyber attack on one country's banking system can spread like a virus, infecting global markets within hours. Again, no victors, just shared destruction. Biological warfare presents another nightmare scenario. A released pathogen, whether intentional or accidental, doesn't respect borders. It doesn't ask for visas. It travels, infects, mutates, and kills. COVID-19 was a wake-up call, and yet the world barely learned. In a war where bioweapons are used, the aftermath would be global panic, economic paralysis, and suffering on a scale few can comprehend. Even the most advanced nations, with all their resources and expertise, would find themselves helpless in the face of something they cannot see or control. And even if none of these weapons are used, even if the war remains conventional, the toll is no less devastating. Tens of millions would be displaced. Cities would be turned into rubble. Cultures would be erased. Families would be separated forever. And while politicians speak in measured tones and generals move pieces on maps, it's ordinary people who pay the price. The people who never voted for war. The people who simply want to live. Then there's the environment. Modern warfare devastates ecosystems. Forests are burned, oceans are poisoned, the air becomes toxic, and wildlife is destroyed. Rebuilding takes decades, if it's possible at all. We already face a climate crisis. A world war would accelerate our self-destruction, pushing the planet past the point of recovery. And again, there is no victory when the very earth beneath our feet becomes uninhabitable. So the question becomes, what does winning even look like now? A flattened enemy city, a collapsed government. Is that worth the price of your own citizens starving, your economy in ruins, and your children growing up in fear? The leaders who speak of strength and dominance are clinging to outdated ideals. They're selling a fantasy of triumph when all they're really offering is mutual ruin. Because modern war is not about conquest, it's about consequence. And those consequences don't discriminate. The world has changed. Our weapons have evolved faster than our wisdom. And in this new reality, war is not a path to greatness. It is a fast lane to annihilation. The smart nations, the truly powerful ones, are not the ones who amass arsenals. They're the ones who resist using them. They're the ones who see war for what it really is, a game in which every player loses and the spectators suffer the most. War has no winners anymore. Just broken homes, scarred skies, and a global society trying to remember what peace once felt like. In the end, it's not about who stood tallest in the ruins. It's about why we ever thought it was worth building them in the first place. Sanity momentarily defeated ego in a world increasingly driven by pride, political theater, and personal legacy. It was a rare moment where rational thought overpowered the intoxication of power. For a brief time, the shouting quieted, the fists unclenched, the missiles remained grounded, not because hearts softened, but because minds sharpened. The people in control, those perched atop governments, military hierarchies, and global institutions, recognized, even if just for a fleeting moment, that the next step forward could be their last, not just politically, but literally. War, especially one of global proportions, has always been fed by ego. Leaders seek legacy. They want to be remembered. They want their name etched in the history books, even if it's written in blood. Their speeches are filled with bravado, their declarations echo with nationalism, and their every move is calculated for maximum perception. In that world, admitting weakness is political suicide. Backing down is seen as cowardice. The performance matters more than the people. But there comes a point where ego collides with reality. And that point came when the cost of the next decision was no longer abstract. War simulations didn't predict strategic victories. They revealed civilian casualties, economic collapse, and irreversible planetary damage. Intelligence reports weren't just numbers and locations. They were warnings screaming into deaf ears. Behind every satellite image, every intercepted call, and every troop movement, the data didn't suggest glory. It forecasted disaster, and something shifted. Perhaps it was the internal advisors whispering harsh truths. Maybe it was the collective pressure from surrounding nations realizing they too would be dragged into the flames. Maybe it was simply the haunting images of past wars replaying in minds that were suddenly not so sure of themselves. But whatever it was, sanity crept in, quietly, urgently, and for once it was heard. This wasn't a moment of moral clarity. It wasn't some awakening of conscience. It was the cold logic of survival overcoming the hot flames of pride. Leaders realized that escalation wouldn't just hurt the enemy, it would destroy their own nations too, their own people, their own families. Ego tells you to push forward no matter the cost. Sanity reminds you that some prices can never be repaid. There was a moment when phone calls that were supposed to deliver ultimatums were instead filled with hesitation. The usual chest-puffing statements to the media became noticeably restrained. Meetings that were expected to confirm aggressive moves instead resulted in stalling tactics. And in that hesitation, in that space where nothing moved and no one acted, sanity had won a temporary battle. It's important to understand how rare that is. In geopolitical history, ego almost always gets the final word. Wars are started by pride, by a need to prove dominance, to show strength, to settle scores. Entire generations have suffered under the decisions of men too proud to admit they were wrong. Cities have been reduced to rubble because one leader couldn't bear to appear weak. And yet here now, for this moment in time, rationality interrupted that cycle. It didn't stop it forever, but it paused it long enough to matter. And that pause may have saved the world. Sanity is often quiet. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't rally crowds. It doesn't win elections. But it's the voice that speaks in the final seconds when everything is at stake. And this time, that voice prevailed. It stood up to ego and whispered the truth. This isn't a game. There are no do-overs, no glory in ashes, no banners flying in the aftermath of nuclear winter. Just silence. Just regret. The world didn't see this battle of ego versus reason play out publicly. It happened in private rooms, through tense conversations, in emergency meetings far from the public eye. The press releases were vague, the cameras didn't capture the fear. But behind the facade, the struggle was real. It was a tug of war between the ancient hunger for power and the desperate instinct to preserve life. And while sanity may have won the moment, the war between ego and reason isn't over. It never really ends. Every new crisis brings new temptations for leaders to play gods with lives that are not their own. The challenge is to remember this moment, to remember how close we came and how much was at stake, and to recognize that the real power lies not in destruction, but in the courage to hold back. Sanity momentarily defeated ego, and that moment, however brief, might have saved humanity from itself. This wasn't peace, it was a tactical pause. the world didn't collectively breathe a sigh of relief because the conflict had been resolved or the differences had been reconciled. No, what happened was far more unsettling. The engines of war didn't stop because people chose unity. They slowed down because the risk of immediate destruction became too real, too close, and too uncontrollable. This was not the end of tensions. It was the holding of breath between rounds. A brief silence in a room still filled with threats. It's tempting to label this moment as victory, to think that because the missiles didn't launch and the troops didn't invade, diplomacy had prevailed. But that's not the truth. What we saw was not peace, it was calculation. The same minds that stirred the conflict, that postured and provoked, that built up arsenals and ran drills along borders. Those minds didn't have a change of heart. They simply saw that the cost of acting right now outweighed the benefits. The damage would have been too immediate, the chaos too unpredictable. And so they backed off, not to fix anything, but to wait, because nothing is resolved. The causes of conflict still sit like loaded guns on every table. The unresolved disputes, the historical grievances, the thirst for influence, the suspicion and distrust, they all remain exactly where they were. Nothing was dismantled, only delayed. This is the dangerous illusion that comes with a ceasefire or a diplomatic standoff that doesn't lead to lasting agreement. People begin to believe the danger has passed. Governments begin to ease their rhetoric just enough to claim success. The world goes back to sleep. And that's when things get risky. The tactical pause we're experiencing is not a truce grounded in understanding. It's a moment where both sides are regrouping. They're watching, analyzing, re-strategizing. They're waiting for weaknesses, for changes in leadership, for shifts in public opinion. They are preparing for the next move, which may not involve tanks or missiles, but sanctions, proxy conflicts, cyber attacks, and economic warfare. It's the calm that precedes the next storm. And it fools the world into thinking the storm was never real to begin with. This kind of pause is a feature of modern conflict. It's not about total war or total peace anymore. It's about managing aggression, calibrating, timing, applying pressure just short of collapse. Countries play a long game now, a strategic game. They create moments of tension, not to explode into battle, but to gain leverage, to test alliances, to manipulate markets. And once they get what they want or realize they can't, they pull back. Not out of restraint, but out of necessity. And that necessity is temporary. As long as the ambitions remain, the rivalry continues. As long as leaders believe they must assert dominance to secure their legacy or appease their base, the danger will persist. And as long as the global system rewards power over principle, force over fairness, these pauses will keep happening until one day, one side miscalculates, one spark, one blunder, one unexpected move, and the pause ends not with negotiation, but with disaster. What's worse is that the public often sees these pauses as progress. They see the headlines soften, the threats retreat, and they begin to move on. But that complacency is dangerous. It allows the architects of war to quietly reload. It gives space for new weapons to be developed, for new strategies to be crafted in silence. It removes the urgency that should remain front and center. The urgency to truly solve, not merely stall. True peace takes more than silence. It takes truth, accountability, mutual recognition, and a willingness to see beyond national interest. It takes courage to dismantle arms, not just pause their use. It takes leadership that values humanity over headlines. And until that kind of peace is pursued, the world will live in cycles of tension, hesitation, and relapse. The pauses will grow shorter. The crisis will escalate faster, and the next time the window to pull back might not be there. This wasn't peace. It was a tactical pause. A pause bought by fear, held together by strategic self-interest, and mistaken by many as a breakthrough. But beneath the quiet, the same engines of conflict still hum, the same ideologies clash, the same ambitions wait in the dark. And unless we recognize this moment for what it truly is, we risk confusing delay with safety. And that is how history repeats itself. We are running out of warnings. The world has been here before, staring over the edge of catastrophe and somehow pulling back at the last possible second. Each time, leaders tell us lessons have been learned, that safeguards are in place, that diplomacy will prevent the next disaster. And yet, here we are again, playing with matches in a room full of explosives, pretending that this time it will be different. But the truth is, every close call we survive only makes the next one more likely to be ignored. We become numb. We grow careless. We stop listening. Every era has its moment of reckoning, its opportunity to change course. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one. The brinkmanship of the Cold War was another. These moments were meant to serve as permanent reminders of how fragile peace is and how quickly it can be shattered. But history, it seems, fades fast in the minds of the powerful. Memories of destruction soften into footnotes. The urgency to act is buried beneath politics, profits, and posturing. We turn the page before we've read the message. The latest escalation that nearly dragged the world into another war was not the first red flag, and it won't be the last. It's another chapter in a long story of missed opportunities to build something better. The warning signs were everywhere. Military buildups, economic sanctions, nationalistic propaganda, cyber attacks, territorial disputes. And yet, instead of confronting these signals with decisive diplomacy and honest dialogue, world powers danced around them, calculated their risks, and played out strategies that treated real lives as bargaining chips. Technology has only raised the stakes. Today's wars don't require armies crossing borders. They can begin with a single keystroke, a cyber attack on a power grid, a virus unleashed on a financial system, a satellite jammed in orbit. And once it starts, the cascade is uncontrollable. The world has never been more interconnected and more vulnerable. And with that interconnectedness comes a dangerous illusion that because we are dependent on each other, we will never destroy each other. But dependency without trust is a trap. It creates friction, not peace. And yet, every time we get close to destruction and somehow avoid it, we convince ourselves that the system works, that someone will always step in, that sanity will always prevail. But that assumption is not only naive, it's deadly. Systems fail, people make mistakes, leaders misjudge, artificial intelligence can miscalculate, and unlike in past centuries, the margin for error is shrinking. One wrong move today doesn't mean a battle, it means global collapse. One miscommunication could trigger retaliation from multiple sides. We've built a world where everything is faster, louder, and more immediate. And that includes war. What we're witnessing isn't just the decay of diplomacy. It's the normalization of escalation. Leaders no longer fear consequences in the same way. They believe they can control the outcomes, limit the damage, survive the fallout. They treat threats like tools. They test red lines like games. And in doing so, they make the extraordinary feel ordinary. That's how wars start, not with a bang, but with a series of smaller acts that no one takes seriously until it's too late. The greatest danger we face now is not just weapons or alliances. It's complacency. It's the belief that because we've survived so far, we'll continue to survive. It's the arrogance that past restraint guarantees future safety. But history doesn't work like that. Warnings don't keep giving themselves forever. Eventually, the alarms fall silent. The next mistake doesn't come with a second chance. The next provocation doesn't end in a phone call. The next leader may not have the restraint or the time to pull back. So here we are again. Averted disaster, temporary relief, and a deafening silence where there should be a roar of reform. The world should be rethinking everything. Its security frameworks, its diplomatic channels, its emergency protocols. Instead, it returns to business as usual. Statements are issued, hands are shaken, and weapons are quietly upgraded. The clock resets, but the bomb remains. We are running out of warnings. And the worst part is, the more we ignore them, the more inevitable the end becomes. The world cannot afford to treat this as another lucky break. It must be a turning point, not just a pause, because one day the warning won't come. One day there won't be time to pull back. And the only thing left will be the question we failed to answer when we still had the chance. Why didn't we take it seriously when we had the time? The future depends on what we do now, not tomorrow, not next year, not after the next election, summit, or press conference, right now. Because the fragile pause we're living in, the brief moment where the missiles didn't launch and the borders weren't crossed, is nothing more than a window. And windows close. History has shown us that again and again. The chance to change direction, to rewrite the ending before it begins, is always temporary. And if we don't use it wisely, we'll look back and realize that the most dangerous thing we did was nothing. We've stepped back from the edge, but we're still standing far too close to it. The machinery of conflict hasn't been dismantled. The ideologies that divide us haven't softened. The thirst for power, dominance, and revenge still flows beneath diplomatic smiles and international agreements. There's no peace treaty, no unified vision, just silence. And silence, as comforting as it may seem, is not peace. It's a test, a question being asked across every capital, every parliament, every military base. What comes next? The answer to that question will define the era we live in. It will decide whether this generation is remembered for avoiding the unthinkable or for ignoring the obvious. Because this isn't just about war and peace. It's about what kind of world we want to build. It's about whether we have the courage to shift from reaction to prevention, from defense to diplomacy, from power games to shared purpose. It's about breaking the cycle that history has trapped us in, where every crisis is followed by delay instead of decision. The future is not some distant abstraction. It's shaped by the choices made in rooms we'll never see, by people we may never vote for, but also by the pressure we apply, the conversations we spark, the truths we refuse to ignore. Leadership isn't limited to those in office. In an interconnected world, every citizen, every voice, every movement matters. Silence is no longer neutral, it's complicity. Because the moment we stop demanding change, the status quo becomes permanent. And the status quo is a ticking clock. Technology has given us unimaginable power. With a few commands, we can destroy cities, disrupt economies, and erase digital infrastructures. But it has also given us the tools to communicate, to organize, to expose, to educate. The future depends on how we use that power, whether we use our platforms to spread division or understanding, whether we build walls or bridges, whether we amplify fear or demand accountability. We've been given reach, speed, and voice like no generation before us. The question is whether we'll use them before it's too late. Diplomacy must no longer be a last resort. It must be the first instinct. Leaders must be judged not by how loud they can shout or how strong their military looks on paper, but by how effectively they can listen, mediate, and compromise. Real strength isn't in the threat. It's in the restraint. It's in the ability to sit across from someone you disagree with and still work toward a solution. The world needs more of that, and less of the theatrics, the slogans, and the hollow declarations. The future depends on education, not just in classrooms, but in public discourse, in understanding how we got here, what's at stake, and how interconnected every crisis truly is. A war between two nations can send shockwaves through the entire planet, economically, environmentally, socially. We need citizens who are informed, who think critically, who question what they're told and seek out the truth, because ignorance isn't just a personal loss anymore, it's a global risk. The most dangerous assumption we can make right now is that someone else will handle it, that the people in charge know what they're doing, that the system will correct itself. History is filled with moments when everyone thought the worst wouldn't happen until it did. And once it happens, there's no undoing it, no rewind button, no second draft. That's why this moment matters more than most people realize. Because this might be the last moment when the future is still ours to shape. We stand at a crossroads, not because we want to, but because we have to. The decisions made in this pause, this fragile, fleeting window will echo for decades. We can't afford to sleepwalk through it. We can't afford to shrug our shoulders and wait for the next warning. The time for analysis is over. The time for excuses is past. What we choose to do now, how we respond to this fragile reprieve, will determine whether we move toward peace or plunge into chaos. The future is not written yet, but the pen is in our hands. Here is the conclusion of the whole speech in the same grounded, powerful, and uncompromising tone. And so here we are, still standing, still breathing, still with a choice. World War III didn't happen, but not because we're wise or united. It was stopped by fear, by hesitation, by the terrifying clarity of what total war really means in the modern age. We've been given a second chance, not a solution, a pause, not peace. The systems that led us to the edge are still in place, and the leaders who play with fire still hold the matches. The future now depends on whether we learn from this narrow escape or ignore it like all the warnings before. This moment must be a turning point, not another missed opportunity, because the next time we get this close, we may not be so lucky. And if we fail to act now, history won't call it a tragedy. It will call it a choice.